In this video, I'm going to talk about something I don't usually talk too much about, and that is presentation and rendering with Blender. Blender is the best free and open source 3D modeling and rendering suite out there, so why not show how you can use your models from anywhere, plug them into Blender, and start rendering. In this case here, let's look at our scene. That's what it looks like, and I've modeled a fairly straightforward and simple building mass just to illustrate how we bring this in here and how we compose it, put a camera, add grass, add trees, add water, a little bit of materiality and background to make a pretty nice image. So for this, we're going to be using an add-on called Gscatter, which is from the makers of Grasswald. And in case you don't know, Grasswald are pretty good grass assets where you can scatter quite a bit. There's a few systems actually for Blender that work as add-ons. One is Grasswald, the other one is Scatter, and the newer one is Bagapie. So Gscatter, again, it's a free add-on for scattering, but the good thing about it is that it comes with some free assets. So we can grow things and make them look really nice pretty easily. So if you click on download for free, and you might need to register and then download the latest version. Then back in Blender, edit, preferences, install from wherever your downloaded version is, install add-on, and then you should be able to see in your sidebar a new tab called Gscatter. And here you can already see I have quite a few systems already set up that are what we see here in the viewport. Now these are only proxies, so simple objects. When we render this out, it actually looks a little bit more detailed, but this helps keep the viewport performant. So let's break down the scene. I'm going to turn off most things here, just so we start from the beginning. The ground plane I've modeled in Blender with subdivision, so it's literally 4 loops in one direction and 4 loops in the other direction. And I've increased the crease, and there's a slight elevation variation. On top of the ground, then we've put the building. And again, in this case, the building massing is quite straightforward, quite simple. I don't want to talk too much about it because it's only there as a placeholder, giving you the idea that you can get your buildings from Blender, from Rhino, from SketchUp, or from Revit, ArchiCAD, anywhere else. Next, I modeled some paths. And now these are starting to take into effect some of Blender's unique and very useful features for architectural visualization. So these paths are simple planes that are extruded. So we have flat profiles, and as you can see, the edit mode, they're floating a little bit. So if we go to the modifier properties, I've subdivided them and then shrink wrap them onto the surface. So wrap method, project, snap on surface, z-axis along the negative and positive, and the target is this object, which is called ground. Then I've done a slight smoothing because I've added a bit of bump on the ground, and then solidifying them to make sure that nothing intersects with our ground plane. As for the materials, these kinds of images, we're not going for extreme photorealism. Instead, we want to have an image that portrays an appropriate scale, so we understand the scale of our object, where it sits, and how it connects to the rest of the site. So that's what we're showing here. You know, I haven't spent a lot of time in materials with the object. You can clearly do a lot of that, or even the grass, you can use a lot of more work. But the people, the trees, even the texture that we have, the materiality on this, all give us a sense of scale. And that's what's important about these conceptual design images, is getting an appropriate sense of scale. So to this material here, the easiest way to do it is to add a simple procedural material within Blender without textures, because textures, raster textures that are downloaded from textures.com or from somewhere else, they tend to look tiled. We can post-process them a bit to make them look less tiled, but I find the quickest way is to create a very simple texture using the brick texture node within Blender, changing the settings a little bit, changing the scale a bit, and then adding a slight variation with the noise texture. So if we turn off the noise, you see everything is still varied in regards to the color that comes from the brick texture, but it looks a bit too uniform, so we have a bit of noise. Then we mix in the noise and the gaps that come in from the brick texture to create a little bit of bump. And that's it for this material. It's not even UV unwrapped, it's just using object coordinates unwrapping and then slightly scaled up or down depending on the type that you use. Most people use point. I use texture sometimes as well. On top of the paths, we have people, and they're scattered with a very simple geometry nodes add-on. These people come from Sketchfab, and I've downloaded a pack, which is over here, slightly isolated just with the people that I want. Made sure that they're more or less the right scale. And then if we go to Geometry Nodes Editor, the setup is very simple. First, we get the paths object, and then we distribute some points on these faces with the minimum distance. And the density factor, we have to be careful here because the default one is very high. So you have to turn that down significantly. And then instance the collection, so the people collection, onto those points. In order for this to work properly, make sure you're using original transformation, enable separate children, and enable reset children. Within the instance on point, make sure you enable pick instance, otherwise all the people are going to be instanced on every single point. For rotation, I've added a random vector value, so we only want to rotate along the Z, so I've kept the X and the Y axes for the minimum and maximum random values to 0, and then change the Z axis. So the people are really the way that we understand the scale of these spaces, and we can add a few more if we increase the density factor here. That's pretty good. Next, I added something that I thought was going to be a road, but I decided to make it a canal. It's flush, but because we're going to have grass on either side, it's going to look okay. And then we have the water that's sitting a little bit further down. That's a very simple plane that intersects with our ground. In fact, I'm looking at it and I'm thinking that it might need to intersect a little bit more in certain places. So that's pretty good. So that's the base setup. From this point on, it's about getting a camera that we're happy with. So if I go to my camera view, what I usually do is go around the model, find an image that will represent the space well, will represent the architecture well, and limits the horizon line so we don't need to model or think too much about what's happening beyond. So I tend to like these bird's eye views that look down, and then go to view, align view, and align active camera to view. I already have a view that I quite like. And if we click on the camera and go to the object data settings, I change the focal length from the default 50 millimeters to 30 millimeters. 50 is a little bit too zoomed in for architectural images, so 30 is the optimal one. We can even go to 20 millimeters or even lower. And next, the world. So if we go to shader editor, object, world, we're using an HDRI because we're rendering with cycles. Now with HDRIs and materials, I use an add-on that's called Lily Surface Scraper, which is free and available on GitHub. So if you go to releases and download it, and then install it within Blender, in Blender, and there's a new subtab called Lily Surface Scraper. And it tells us the available sources. So we can either go to Polyhaven or this other website. So if I go to Polyhaven and select an HDRI that I like, and then copy the URL, and then back in Lily Surface Scraper, we click on import from clipboard. It starts to import it, and it tells us which variant we want. I usually pick the 2K HDR, and then that's already set up. By the way, we can do the same with materials with Lily Surface Scraper. So if I click on the paths and go to material properties and scroll down, we see we have a tab called Lily Surface Scraper. There's quite a few more available sources. So we can click on one of them, find a texture that we quite like or a material with all the textures available, copy the URL and then import it, and then it automatically sets it up exactly like we have here for the HDRI. Once we have the HDRI, we can rotate. So with the mapping, so this is all automatic by Lily Surface Scraper, so we don't even need to worry about setting it up. The only thing we can do is tweak the Z rotation. That gives us different lighting for the model. So now we have the camera, we have the background, which gives us the lighting, and we have the basic setup. We're ready to start scattering some additional assets. So in the Gscatter tab, I have 1, 2, 3, 4 different systems. Let's start with the first one, creeping bent grass. First off, how do you get these made. So we click on this little icon here, which is the Gscatter asset browser. These are the default ones that come with Gscatter, which is great. Thank you so much, Grasshold guys, for making this. And let's pick on one. So use this creeping bendcrass big, which is over here. And once we have a system, let me turn it on. Once we have a system, then we can go into the effect layers. And there are 4 kind of subtabs, 4 categories. So distribution, scale, rotation, and geometry. And we can click on each one and it has some effects. It's almost like modifiers. So it has its own modifier stack. Now all this works with geometry nodes. So we don't need to worry too much about it. But in case you are interested to see what's happening, we can click on the object, go to the geometry nodes editor. And that's the setup it looks. It looks very clean, very modular. You know, they've made like each operation its own group that you can go into and figure out more with what's happening. For example, proximity and how it's being used. We won't worry too much about this because thankfully it's been done for us. So what we need to worry about is how to make this work properly with our context, with our model. And there are a couple of things we can do. When we first add a system, we only get distribute on faces. We have viewport density and render density. I've turned this up in this case to 65 to make it look well and kept the viewport density quite low so the viewport remains fairly performant. Then on top of that, we have camera culling, and that limits, as you can see, the geometry scattering, the object scattering only to the area that the camera can see. Now we have to set the focal length here manually. By default it's 50 and look what happens when it's 50. It's much more cropped in. So we have to manually change this to 30. And then the other setting that's important is this buffer. If it's left at 0, the geometry goes exactly to the border. Usually we want a bit more of a buffer area so we get the shadow effects and intersections looking properly along the edges. In fact, let's go to something like 0.7. So we have even a bit more. So that's the basis, that's the setup. Then the next 4 modifiers are exclusions for these objects. So they're called proximity. So you can add effect layers by clicking on here. And each subtab, so distribution, scale, rotation, has its own set of effect layers. It's a very neatly organized and easy to understand add-on. So in here, proximity, I've selected the building. So we don't want to intersect with the building. Unfortunately, this works only with edges, I believe. So you can see that we still have some geometry that's underneath, but that's okay because we won't really get to see it. We can change the distance multiplier, but in my case, that's okay. The next one is paths. So we don't want any geometry intersecting with our paths. Then I've created one for the water. And then finally one for the road. And the road one, yeah, it works quite all right. So once we're happy with the setup of one, what we can do is then duplicate the scatter item. So that's going to duplicate all the settings that we have already done. So you don't need to manually do this for each system because it's usually good to have a couple of systems of grass to make it look a bit more realistic. So I've added a few more, and again, they have the same sets of proximities. The only difference is the render density and the seed. Otherwise, camera culling and the 4 proximities, they should be fairly similar. Although I can see here I have a few more intersections. So let's see what's happening in here. Maybe we can turn this up to 4 so we have less geometry showing on top of this. And then I've added another system. Now we can also paint. So that gives us a more natural, if we add a weight mask layer, and I believe we need to create a group, or maybe it does it automatically. Let's see. But if we click on this icon, it takes us directly to weight mask. And then we should be able to start painting. Because we're dealing with a very low poly mesh, we have to see where we have edges. There. So we only see this kind of grass in specific areas. So the geometry is quite low poly for the ground. If we want, we can add more loop cuts, but I think that should work pretty well. So we paint it and then we can uncheck to leave the weight mask. So let's go back to our view mode here. Now let's do the same for this other layer that I've duplicated. So all the layers are exactly the same. We have the full proximities, camera culling, and distribute on faces. So let's add another effect, weight mask, and click to paint. Go to top view. I find wireframe works the best for this. And let's see if we can paint different sets of areas here. I think in the end they will be quite a bit similar, but maybe we can add a slight bit of variety by painting. Okay, now let's go back out. So that's for the grasses. So they're pretty much done. So if we render out, let me turn off trees and let's go and render this just so we have a good idea of what we're working with here. Now these renders, I have a RTX 2080 card. So they don't take long. They take about 1.5 minutes. So here are the settings that I use. Render engine is obviously Cycles. Feature set supported, device GPU compute. Max samples, I keep them quite down, something like 250, and then enable denoise. And that's looking quite well over here and over here, so we can carry on. So the trees, they're a very similar system. I've duplicated one of these systems and then changed some settings. I changed the distance minimum for the distribution. The render density and viewport density is the same because it doesn't need to be a lot. In regards to the tree models, I've put in a collection something that I found on BlendSwap. So in case you don't know this website, definitely check it out because all the models here are free and they're all specifically made for Blender in the spirit of Blender and open source. So I looked for trees and I found this model, grass and tree system, and took out the 6 tree models and placed them in here and then used them as a scatter with a slightly random scale and rotation, which is set up here. So scale, randomize. So with the slightly random scale and rotation, which is set up in the Gscatter settings. So scale, and then I randomized X, Y, Z, and then the same with rotation. Now, when I rendered out, you might have seen something else that we had here, which are these bushes. I've created some bushes. Again, I got them from BlendSwap, and there's the ability in Blender if we add a path. So let's do this with the new setup here. So Shift A, curve, and it doesn't matter what we add, to be honest, any of them work. And then if we go into edit mode, there's a new tool where we can draw a freehand spline. So we can erase all of this. It should be all selected, and then X and delete vertices. And then we want to go to the tool settings and make sure depth is set to surface. Once that's set, we can draw any kind of curve that we want and it follows the surfaces. Next, to scatter it, let's create a new geometry node setup and resample these curves. Shift A, curve, resample curve, place that in here. And that gives us the separate number of points. And we want to change this from count to length and use something, let's say 1 meter. Next, Shift A, search instance on points. So let's add that in here. And we can drag the bushes collection. So in this case, I downloaded some bushes from BlendSwap, as I mentioned. So I can drag this collection in here and then place it into instances. Now that's quite crazy. What's going on here? So first we need to separate children, reset children, so they're the correct scale, and then pick instance. So we only get 1 scale. And they look quite large, so we can change this scale here. So if we can click and hold all 3, we can change them at the same time. And let's try 0.6. That's much better. Or I prefer to add a value. So if we drag this and search for value, and let's try 0.5. So that works pretty well. So that's it. That's all that this setup does. Then I've added some randomization of where the paths are located and set this up in a way where it always snaps to the ground plane, even when we accidentally draw something like this, which goes in this case on top of the building. To randomize the scattering a little bit more along the path, we can do a couple of things. We can add a rotation randomness, so add random value here, and we want these X and Y values to be 0, and we can change this. Now this, in this case, it works in radians. If you wanted to go full, we should have pi and pi. One should be negative and the other one should be positive. And now they should be twisting everywhere. We can do something similar with scale. So Shift A, search random value. And here I use the vector because we need that to only rotate along the z-axis. For the scale, we don't need to use a vector. We can use a simple value. And let's change this from something like 0.3 to 0.7. That's great. So they all vary in their heights. And to scatter them a little bit more, so they're not completely linear, we'll add a set position. So search, set position, put that in here. And for the offset, first we want to combine X, Y, Z. And next, let's put in a random value again. And then we can set how much we want that to be. Now at the moment, it's moving everything, it seems, quite synchronous. Well, it's not quite. I can see that there's a bit of a difference. Let's add another random value and plug that into Y and change the seed. And we can change the number slightly so it's a bit more varied. So that's the setup that I used for the Bezier curve that you see here. So I'm going to hide that. Now let's go to our camera view. Make sure that everything is okay. Always a good idea to save before we render out. So we talked already about samples. Then we need to talk about color management. The default is filmic, and for this, in this case, I did use look. I left it the default one, which is the same as medium contrast. That works quite well. Now if we go to shader editor and then world, one setting that I have changed is the strength of the background. The HDRI that I'm using is Belfast Farmhouse, and I found that 1 is a little bit too low. In fact, let's put it to 1 so you can see. So I changed that to 2.5 and that works pretty well. So now we are ready to render. So F12. And I'm using the default 1920 by 1080 resolution in this case. It will take a little bit to initialize depending on the size of you, because the grass is a lot of scatters. And I noticed that my trees are off. We can see here that they're not showing in the viewport. So let's escape, turn them on. Now let's try this again. Oh, how wonderful. I have a tree exactly in the middle of the lake. So we need to change that. We can do that with the seed. It's interesting because here it shows up in that location. So I'm not sure why it's a little bit different. But it does happen every once in a while. That's okay. So if we go to Gscatter, trees, distribution, let's change the seed. See if we can get rid of it. That looks a bit better. So let's try again. All right. So once the rendering is done, we can save it. Alt-S. And then let's save it as the full OpenEXR file. So that makes sure that we have a good size that we can work with. And I'll call this image 03. We can also save a JPEG just to make sure that we can see what is happening. Then in my case, I take it in Affinity Photo, which has become my preferred photo editing software. And the good thing is that it opens EXRs automatically. So then this is the full 24-bit or 32-bit, I'm not quite sure, but it has a lot of information. So we see we need to post-process a little bit because some of our highlights are blown. So we'll do that with something that's called a tone mapping persona. So let's duplicate this layer, Control J, just so we keep the original. We don't need the alpha. Click on it, go to tone mapping persona. And the default already works quite well. I'm going to go to the detailed one. So keep tone compression to the max because that's the only way we get all of these details here. Because this object is quite wide compared to most other things that we have in the scene here. Let's turn up local contrast a bit. And everything else can stay as is. I think this is a bit too cool, so I'll change it to 10, minus 10, and then apply. So now we have a good base to work with that we can modify a little bit more. I think that most images that come out from rendering software are a little bit too oversaturated. So I always like to add the black and white filter. And in this case, we can also manipulate it in such a way by reducing the greens and the yellows. So we make those areas darker so our building pops out a little bit more. Let's change the opacity to 50 or even a bit less. Now let's add curves for further refinement and brighten up the image a bit more in the midst. That's working pretty well. Next, let's add a vignette. Make sure it's all the way on top. Reduce the exposure to the minimum. Change this shape so it becomes a bit of an oval and increase the scale. Something like this. And now what I like to do is add a bit of fog. So if we search in Google for ground fog alpha, we should get some quite nice images that we can superimpose onto the image. So I usually like to go to tools, size, and change it to large. So this is quite nice. So let's copy the image, then paste it increase the size and then change to screen. We can play a bit with the curves, with the levels rather. So we have the effect a little bit more. And let's make sure it's only working with the image. Now I think it has to be in a very specific way. And what might look even better is if this fog is flipped. So right click, transform, and flip vertical. So we have more fog towards the top and the right hand side. That's working pretty well. Let's put this underneath the vignette. So then we get the vignette effect on top of that. Let's adjust this slightly to 50. And let's reduce this image to 60. Maybe a bit less. Let's try 50. So again, this is a very good base now. It's not perfect. There are a lot of things that can be changed. But once again, we're not looking for photorealism here. What we're looking for is to have a good representation for a model, for conceptual design, in order to understand the model a bit better of how it sits in its site and the scale and relationship to trees, to people, to anything else that's going on in the vicinity, within the contextual vicinity. So here we can see some people, so we clearly understand the scale of that. We understand that this is in maybe a park land area or wild area. It could be some kind of museum, bridge, and we understand how big the trees are in relationship to that. Now I would like to show you a few more examples of what's possible with Blender. This user does really excellent interiors. If you're into interiors, you can get excellent results. That's the model, and that's the final version of it. Then here's some more examples from users. This is Blender Artist. If you don't know it, that's the main Blender forum organized by the community. It's usually a lot more artistic friendly, but every once in a while people do post topics related to architecture, design, and architectural visualization. And then here's another one that's quite good. So these are excellent renderings really about a project, both daytime, nighttime, internal, and with snow. Really good renderings. In this case, this user, Adrian, also has written up an excellent guide of making of. It's in Polish, but with Google Auto Translate, you can get it. And it's typical of the stuff you find in the big rendering blogs. So he goes through the whole process, like mood board, tools used, modeling, how he does pretty much every aspect of it, organization, and then assets. And that's quite important. There are a lot of assets available for Blender and for scattering. So I already mentioned the Scatter 5 add-on, which is a paid one, and it's more capable than Gscatter than typical material setups. So I highly recommend checking this out. I'll put a link in the video description below. So now if you're interested to know more about Blender for architectural visualization, if you are curious of how to get your SketchUp, Rhino, Revit, or any other kinds of models within Blender or model further within Blender, let me know in the comments below and I'll be happy to make some more videos. This file is available on Patreon, so you can look at it in more detail, and see you next time.